enter the shadows of one of the most horrifying incidents in Crawford County, Arkansas history. Please take a moment to let us know where you are watching from and the precise moment you are hearing these words in the comments section before we get into this unsettling story. I'm interested in learning which regions of the planet and when times of day or night this sordid past is accessible. It was 1893. The valleys in northwest Arkansas, where the recently built rail lines had started to cut through the remoteness of the little towns scattered across Crawford County, were long shadowed by the Boston Mountains. Two sisters would make a lasting impression on local memory in this area, where superstition and tradition permeated every aspect of daily life. Their impact would be as unsettling as the smiles they gave to all who entered their home. The Blackwood sisters lived against the grain during a time when the majority of women were classified according to their status as spouses, widows, or daughters of men. Their generosity became legendary among visitors on the dirt roads that connected Van Buren to the outlying villages, as they greeted newcomers with an odd warmth. Few realized that beneath those friendly smiles were plans that would eventually lead to one of the most horrifying incidents in Arkansas history. The final strands of this unsettling tale would be unraveled in the bitterly cold winter of 1893 as the merciless wind of February ripped through the hills, unveiling a pattern that had been concealed for almost 20 years. The events that follow are painstakingly reconstructed from court documents, newspaper reports, and testimonies, the majority of which were kept under wraps until 1968. When a county clerk was remodeling the Van Buren courthouse and found a secret compartment in an old filing cabinet, Crawford County residents would never again view a warm grin in the same way. These hills still reverberate with the sound of the train whistle, bringing with it memories that many people would prefer to forget. The sisters' unsettling cold case, which they greeted with sly smiles. It was known as the Bitter Valley, the name of the tiny area, which was tucked away between two hills of the Boston Mountains, came from the harshness of existence that seemed to cling to those who lived there rather than the flavor of the soil. In 1871, Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood set up their farm here, some 12 miles northeast of Van Buren. The sisters bought the land from Sarah Hartley, a widow who was keen to get away following her husband's untimely death, according to county records. Not because two unmarried women were purchasing real estate, although that was rare enough, but rather because they made the payment in cash, which was uncommon in an area where the general store's credit or barter was the norm. The sisters kept to themselves at first, according to an 1887 statement made by Jacob Miller, the proprietor of the closest general store. Only came in for necessities, always polite, always smiling. But something about those smiles never quite reached their eyes. The Blackwood sisters had built a small but cozy cottage by 1874. Their two-story white clapboard home had a large front porch where they frequently sat in identical rocking chairs to observe the surrounding road. Behind the home were a smokehouse, a barn, and what the locals called the long shed, a small structure whose function was unknown to the neighbors. Although precise birth documents have never been located, the sisters were in their late 22s when they arrived, tall and slim, with auburn hair usually tied up in a strict bun. Elizabeth was the elder, by around 2 years. Margaret, who had a slightly larger shape and was a little shorter, wore her darker hair in the same style. The characteristics of both women were strikingly similar. Small lips, high cheekbones, and pale gray eyes that are described as abnormally bright in a number of stories. Their seemingly contradictory nature, intensely secretive in their personal concerns, yet uncommonly welcoming to travelers and strangers, traveling through the valley, was what really set them apart, not their appearance. Around an 1894 interview with the Arkansas Gazette, Reverend Thomas Galloway said, "They started offering rooms to travelers sometime in '75. It wasn't a proper boarding house as such, just a place where folks could rest if they were journeying through. Word spread quick enough in these parts. Hospitality to travelers is Christian duty, but the Blackwood sisters took it beyond what was common. The majority of Crawford County residents were unaware that the Blackwood name had previously been mentioned in newspapers as far east as Tennessee and as far north as Missouri before they moved to Arkansas. These mentions were always brief and always related to mysterious disappearances, but there was never enough proof to support more than a passing reference. The scene was prepared. The valley had its guardians, and the first of many who would encounter the sisters' unusual welcome would soon arrive down the long road that went by their porch. In March of 1876, a late winter blizzard caused Fort Smith cattle buyer William Fletcher, 38, to seek shelter on the back roads of Crawford County. As the sky grew ominous with clouds, Fletcher saw the Blackwood house, according to evidence he would later give. According to his account, Fletcher said, "I wasn't keen on stopping. Something about the place felt wrong even from the road, but the alternative was getting caught in what looked to be a terrible storm, so I approached." The pattern that would characterize the Blackwood sisters for years to come was set by what transpired next. Both women appeared on the porch as though they had been waiting for Fletcher as he rode up to the house. As they greeted him, their synchronized gestures and identical smiles instantly made him feel uneasy. According to reports, Elizabeth said, "Good evening, sir. You've arrived just in time. We've set up a spot for you," Margaret continued. This remarkable ability to predict visits became a recurrent theme in survivor narratives, even though Fletcher had not announced his arrival in advance. Some hypothesized more unsettling theories, while others ascribed it to the house's location on a ridge that provided extended vistas of the approaching road. They ushered Fletcher into a well-kept front room with a fireplace, 2 wing-back chairs, and walls covered in frames and pressed flowers. Despite the increasing wind, he observed the extraordinary quiet of the house. No ticking clock, no creaking floorboards, and no outside noise. "They insisted I eat before resting," Fletcher remembered. "Brought out a stew that smelled wonderful, but tasted oddly bitter. I managed only a few bites before making an excuse about fatigue." This would turn out to be a lucky choice. Fletcher was brought to a bedroom upstairs, which was spotless, like the rest of the home, but unnerving in some way. There was a bed, a washstand, and a rocking rocker facing the bed instead of the window, which he thought was an odd arrangement. "I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle," Fletcher acknowledged. "Something told me sleep would be dangerous in that house." His intuition was right. Fletcher heard the distinct sound of someone testing his door handle just after midnight, and then he heard whispers in the hallway. For a few minutes before the presence retreated, he would later recall hearing what sounded like fingernails dragging slowly along the outside of the door. When morning arrived, Fletcher saw the sisters in the kitchen, both of them asking in almost chorus if he had slept well, and grinning as if nothing had happened. He refused breakfast and hurried away, using $2 silver that Margaret pocketed without glancing at them to cover his accommodation. "As I rode away," Fletcher said, "I glanced back to see them still standing on the porch, still smiling, still watching. They hadn't moved an inch. It was as though they were posing for a photograph that nobody was taking." Without establishing so many elements that would resurface in subsequent accounts, Fletcher's experience might have remained little more than a haunting story. The anticipatory welcome, the bitter food, the nighttime disturbance, and most notably, the sisters' coordinated movements and unwavering smiles. But William Fletcher's luck would not be shared by most travelers. According to county records, at least 27 individuals who were known to be traveling through Crawford County between 1876 and 1893 vanished from sight after passing through what the locals had come to refer to as Blackwood Valley. A salesman here, a migrant worker there, people whose absence might not instantly raise alarms were the first to go missing. The ideal targets were those who moved about a lot and had weak, at best, ties to the community. In the late summer of 1877, Orville Jenkins, a railroad land surveyor, arrived at the Blackwood house. Jenkins, in contrast to Fletcher, accepted the sisters' supper offer. Months later, he wrote in a notebook discovered among his belongings that the lunch was unusual but not unpleasant, and that he felt strangely heavy, as though my thoughts were moving through molasses thereafter. In his last journal entry, Jenkins writes in increasingly erratic handwriting, "Something wrong with this place. The sisters never sleep. I've watched through the keyhole. They sit in the kitchen all night, whispering. Can't make out the words. Head foggy. Door locked, but doesn't feel safe. They're smiling at me through the woods somehow. I can feel it. When Jenkins did not return to his employers, he was reported missing. Authorities found the Blackwood house after a quick examination, but it had been almost 2 weeks by then. The sisters were understandably alarmed, verified that Jenkins had indeed spent one night there, and clarified that he had departed early the next morning, heading north. They didn't search their property. Over the ensuing years, this pattern would recur with unsettling frequency. A tourist would vanish. The Blackwood house might be the answer to some questions. The sisters would be worried. Their timelines always believable, their stories always fitting, their smiles always there. Authorities lacked justification for a more thorough inquiry in the absence of proof of misconduct. Sheriff James Hawkins said they were careful in remarks following the case's public disclosure. Never took locals, never took people with strong connections to the area. Always had explanations that couldn't be disproven. And they had a way about them, a way of smiling that made you want to believe them, even when your gut told you something wasn't right. Locals had grown weary of the Blackwood sisters by 1883. Parents advised kids to stay away from the road that passes their house, even if there was no proof against them. At Miller's General Store, travelers were advised to look for alternative lodging. In response, the sisters grew even more solitary, only going out into town when it was absolutely necessary. Strangely enough, though, they showed no signs of the resentment that one might anticipate from women who were steadily shunned during their infrequent appearances. Rather, they continued their amiable manners and steady smiles, buying their groceries, and spoke courteously as if they were utterly oblivious to the murmurs that trailed after them. It was their consistency that unnerved folks most, said Abigail Parker, a longtime Van Buren resident, in an interview with the Arkansas Gazette. Most people, when they're upset or hurt, they show it somehow. The Blackwoods never did. Same expressions, same posture, same words almost, year after year. It wasn't natural. During these years, what was going on behind the white clapboard house's charming exterior? Bank documents found during the ensuing investigation offer some hints, but the whole truth would not come to light until later. The Blackwood sisters regularly deposited money into an account at Arkansas National Bank in Van Buren between 1876 and 1893. Even while none of these deposits were particularly substantial, they added up over time. The timing of the deposits, which often happened soon after disappearances were recorded in the area, was more telling than the numbers. The sisters conducted their business, including the finances, in a meticulous manner. The Blackwood sisters became increasingly isolated as rumors about them circulated across Crawford County. However, the stream of unwary passengers persisted, albeit at a slower pace. The danger was lessened for those who understood to stay away from the house with the broad porch and the women with the constant grins. The risk was as severe as ever for strangers traveling through. One disappearance at a time, the Bitter Valley kept living up to its reputation. Early in the fall of 1884, the weather changed. Before the harvest was finished, frost was brought by a cold wind that blew down from the Boston Mountains. Farmers scrambled to save what crops they could, while itinerant traders rushed to wrap up their operations before the roads turned treacherous. Daniel Cooper, a 42-year-old household products vendor, who had been operating in the area between Fort Smith and Fayetteville for almost 10 years, was one of these passengers. Many people in the region knew Cooper not exactly as a friend, but as a recognized face who occasionally brought news from neighboring places and useful supplies. Pulled by an elderly but dependable mare named Bessie, he went in a modified wagon that doubled as a mobile storefront and a means of transportation. In addition to his semi-regular presence in the neighborhood, Cooper's practice of keeping thorough notes of his trips and transactions in a compact, leather-bound ledger set him apart from earlier guests at the Blackwood house. Cooper kept track of purchases, locations, and observations on the areas he covered. This would turn out to be an important habit. According to Cooper's ledger, he sold kitchen tools in the northern portion of Crawford County on the 17th of October, 1884, weather turning, unlikely to reach Winfrey Township before nightfall. Recall mention of lodging available near Crossroads. Will inquire. This brief note, written in increasingly weak handwriting, was the last written record of Cooper's activities. The next day, he was supposed to meet with a Winfrey Township store owner, But he didn't show up, and after 3 days, people became concerned. Cooper's absence was noticed right away and handled carefully. In contrast to earlier disappearances, he had established roots, was well known, and kept regular appointments. People noticed when he disappeared. A search crew led by Sheriff James Hawkins took Cooper's most likely path. They found Cooper's wagon partially hidden in a thicket about half a mile from the Blackwood property 2 days into the search, which would drastically change the course of the inquiry. All the goods had been carefully removed from the cart. Cooper's personal possessions, such as the money pouch he concealed under the driver's seat and a tiny box filled with unsold silver pocket watches, were unaltered. There was no sign of his horse. It made no sense as a robbery, Sheriff Hawkins subsequently said. The valuable items were left behind. It looked more like someone wanted the man himself, not his possessions. It was no longer possible to overlook the Blackwood house's vicinity. Sheriff Hawkins had the right to carry out a more exhaustive investigation now that he had tangible evidence: the abandoned wagon. On the 22nd of October, 1884, he and 4 deputies made their way to the Blackwood house. They were greeted by the sisters with their usual grins and seeming candor. They acknowledged that 5 days prior, a hawker had definitely made an appearance at their home. He had sought cover from the approaching weather, stayed overnight, and left early the next day, moving north into Winfrey Township. The sisters were understandably shocked and alarmed to learn of Cooper's wagon's discovery. Even when asked for specifics, their story remained consistent. In a spirit of helpful collaboration, they allowed the sheriff and his men to search their home and barns. There was nothing immediately odd found throughout the search. Almost bizarrely, the house was spotless. There were no indications of conflict or Cooper's presence beyond what the sisters had already acknowledged. There was only one horse in the barn, their own. Only their own livestock's preserved meats were kept in the smokehouse. Not until the deputies arrived at what the locals referred to as the long shed did Elizabeth Blackwood's smile crack for the first time in anyone's memory. Neighbors had always been curious about the shed, which was about 30 feet long and 10 feet broad. It seemed like a normal storage building from the outside, but it was exceptionally well built for that use. "We keep our personal items there," Elizabeth said, smiling again as she pulled a key out of her pocket. "Family heirlooms and such. Nothing of interest to your investigation, I'm sure." 2 small windows at either end of the shed provided limited illumination for the interior. As the men's eyes adapted, they noticed that both long walls were lined with rows of shelves, each of which held what seemed like different-sized glass jars. A big wooden table with leather straps fastened to the edges for holding deer carcasses in place while they were being butchered stood in the middle of the space. Without being asked, Margaret said, "Much cleaner than trying to process them in the yard." Sheriff Hawkins walked over to one of the shelves and picked up a jar, bringing it up to the window light. It included what looked like a human ear, submerged in a murky liquid. According to the sheriff's report, which was filed later that day, upon this discovery, I ordered the immediate arrest of Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood on suspicion of murder. Both women were taken into custody without protest, but they insisted on their innocence and kept smiling in a way that was, I can only describe as deeply unsettling the entire time. 87 jars, containing human remains, mostly minor body pieces, including fingers, ears, and what multiple deputies recognized as tongue segments, were found after a thorough examination of the shed. Despite a thorough investigation that including excavating in multiple places where the dirt seemed to have been disturbed, no full corpses were discovered on the site. The sisters declined to give precise replies when asked what was in the jars. They kept grinning and just said that they should be let to remain in the same cell. Crawford County and beyond were rocked by the Blackwood house discovery. Despite the physical evidence, the case against the Blackwood sisters remained circumstantial, with newspapers as far away as Little Rock reporting the incident and calling the sisters monsters in feminine form and the shed a chamber of horrors unprecedented in the state's history. It would be challenging to prove murder in the absence of bodies and witnesses. The sisters had chosen their victims carefully, disposed of the evidence methodically, and told consistent accounts. An unexpected source, a prior visitor who had survived a night at the Blackwood house and recognized the sisters' names from newspaper accounts, provided the breakthrough, not the investigation into Cooper's disappearance. A 54-year-old livestock trader named Thomas Reed called the police with information that would eventually start to reveal the full scope of the sisters' operations. Like William Fletcher years before, Reed had refused to eat the food his hostesses had provided during his stay at the Blackwood House in the spring of 1882. "I had a rule when traveling," Reed said, "never eat food prepared by strangers unless you see them eat it first. The Blackwood women, they served me, but didn't join me at the table, said they'd already eaten. That was enough for me to just move the food around my plate and pretend." Reed claimed to have heard the same unusual scratching noises, whispers in the corridor, and someone testing his door handle during the night, just as Fletcher had recounted. Reed, however, had a hypothesis as to what might have occurred to anyone who ate the sisters' food, unlike Fletcher. "I raised my suspicions to Sheriff Collins over in Sebastian County when I got back home," Reed said. "But without evidence, there wasn't much to be done. I warned folks I knew who traveled that way, but I never expected the scale of what they were doing." Authorities searched the surrounding region more thoroughly as a result of Reed's statement and the tangible evidence found in the shed. Investigators found what looked to be a disposal site in a network of caves known locally as Devil's Den, about a mile from the Blackwood House. According to a study of skeletal components, the human remains in the cave, in varying levels of decomposition, represented at least 21 different individuals. Much of the evidence had been lost due to the remote location and natural processes, but some patterns were discernible. The majority of the bones had indications of precision cutting, which is compatible with deliberate dismemberment as opposed to animal scavenging. According to Dr. William Harrington, who helped with the remains study, they processed them like livestock: clean cuts, systematic separation of parts. Whatever their purpose, it wasn't done in frenzy or passion. This was calculated. Additional evidence was found after the Blackwood residence was investigated further. Deputies found a variety of personal belongings, including wallets, watches, rings, and other things, hidden under floorboards in the kitchen. These goods were likely belonging to the victims. Every item was wrapped in fabric and given a date label. There were no names on the labels. The dates ranged from 1871 to 1884. In support of the hazy links to disappearances in other states that researchers would subsequently establish, the earliest date, which came before the sisters arrived in Crawford County, indicated that their actions had started elsewhere. A leather-bound journal that was hidden in a compartment constructed into Elizabeth Blackwood's bed frame was the most unsettling of all the finds. The journal, which was written in an exquisite and exact style, contained what seemed like recipes, but not for everyday foods. In a May 1879 entry, it states, Subject 12. Male, approximately 30 years, robust constitution. Preparation A yielded stronger effect than in previous subjects. Unconsciousness achieved in 17 minutes, rather than usual 25 to 30. Margaret believes the addition of white snake root to be responsible. Will continue with this modification. The last puzzle piece came from the notebook. The sisters had been methodically testing a variety of natural poisons and sedatives derived from regional plants, recording the results of their experiments on gullible tourists who accepted their hospitality. The publication never made clear why these tests were conducted or why human remains were gathered. Elizabeth never discussed motivations in her writings. Instead, she concentrated only on techniques and observations. Decades of conjecture over the sisters' actual motivations would be stoked by this lack of explanation. Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood were still being held in the Crawford County Jail in Van Buren by the end of 1884, pending trial for the murder of Daniel Cooper and possibly many additional victims. Since their arrest, their behavior has not changed much. They nonetheless maintained their innocence, smiled at both visitors and guards, and moved and spoke with the coordinated accuracy that had always made others uncomfortable. Reverend Galloway wrote, "It's as though they don't understand the gravity of their situation," following his visit to the sisters in prison. Or perhaps they understand something the rest of us don't. Either possibility is deeply troubling. A darkness that had been hidden for so long by the smiling faces that had covered it up was exposed by the Blackwood sisters' case. This darkness was particularly unsettling in rural Arkansas. An extraordinary event took place at the Crawford County Jail on a chilly January morning in 1885. During his rounds at around 4:30 a.m., the night guard found that Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood were not in the cell. The barred window was still in place, and there were no indications that the lock had been tampered with. No other inmates claimed to have heard any strange noises during the night. The sisters had just disappeared. Sheriff Hawkins set up search groups right away to go through the neighborhood. Law enforcement agencies in Arkansas and neighboring states received descriptions of the women, and neighboring counties were informed. The massive manhunt produced no results, not a single sighting that seemed believable. One deputy said, "It was as though they'd turned to smoke. No footprints in the mud outside, no missing horses from nearby stables, no reports of strange women seen on the roads. They were there, and then they weren't." There was a lot of conjecture around the escape. Although no proof of collaborators had surfaced during the investigation, others claimed the sisters had Confederates who helped them. Others, especially those with a more superstitious inclination, murmured worse beliefs about supernatural talents and powers no God-fearing person should possess. Although it was never confirmed, the most plausible theory was that the sisters had gotten a duplicate key to their cell by paying or otherwise compromising a jail staff member. Sheriff Hawkins looked into this aspect in great detail. But if there was corruption, the guilty party never came forward or turned on themselves. The prosecution against the Blackwood sisters stagnated once the main suspects were removed. Legal processes could not progress without the ladies themselves to stand trial, even though the physical evidence was still there and the testimonies were recorded. Although technically open, the lawsuit was becoming less and less active. As months went by, with no fresh information, public interest also started to decline. Newspapers had stopped mentioning the Smiling Sisters of Crawford County by the middle of 1885. By 1886, more recent tragedies and scandals had mostly supplanted them in the public conversation. In Crawford County, things gradually got back to normal. After the sisters were arrested, the county seized the Blackwood property, which was still unoccupied. Eventually, the buildings were destroyed, and the materials used for less contaminated structures, since local superstition prohibited their sale or reuse. 10 years later, the clearing where the white clapboard home had been was recovered by nature. As the seasons changed, only the fieldstone foundation was left to be seen, slowly eroding into the ground. If not for what transpired 8 years later, the case may have remained little more than a troubling footnote in local history. Early in 1893, on February 12, 1893, Thomas Blackwood, claiming to be Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood's nephew, arrived in Van Buren. Blackwood, a well-dressed man in his early 30s, explained that he had only lately discovered his aunt's infamous past while looking into his family's history. He said, "I come not to defend their actions, which appear indefensible, but to understand them," to Sheriff William Davis, who had taken James Hawkins' post after he resigned, "and perhaps to make what amends I can to the community they harmed." Considering the timing, nearly 8 years after the sisters' escape, Blackwood's entrance immediately raised suspicion. He was briefly detained by Sheriff Davis for interrogation, but there was no legal justification for his detention. Since nothing was known about the Blackwood family's past, the man's documents sounded authentic, and his account of being raised in Mississippi by distant cousins following the loss of his parents seemed believable. After booking a room at the Van Buren Hotel, Thomas Blackwood started what he called personal research on his aunt's case. He visited the former Blackwood property multiple times, spoke with anyone who would talk to him about the sisters, and asked to see the material gathered throughout the inquiry. He seemed genuinely troubled by his connection to those women, pointed out County Courthouse Clerk Martin Wilson. Spent hours going through the records, taking notes, asked thoughtful questions. Never tried to excuse what they'd done. Said several times he wanted to understand so he could ensure nothing like it ever happened in his family again. Thomas Blackwood conducted his investigation without any problems for nearly 2 weeks. He was consistently kind, articulate, without being intrusive, and suitably solemn considering the type of questions he was asking. Many residents even expressed empathy for the individual, who was dealing with a very troubling family history. A young woman named Ella Richards, a housekeeper at the Van Buren Hotel, did not come home at the end of her evening shift on February 27. The next morning, her relatives reported her missing. Nothing out of the ordinary was found when her hotel things were searched, with the exception of a brief letter on hotel stationery that read, "Mr. Blackwood requests assistance with organizing his research materials this evening. Will likely return late." When Sheriff Davis went to question Thomas Blackwood right away, he found that he had also vanished after leaving the motel just after midnight. No personal belongings were left behind, and his room was discovered in perfect shape. He also lost the study materials he had gathered while there. It was impossible to overlook the suspicious circumstances and timing. Sheriff Davis ordered a comprehensive search of the region, paying special attention to the cave system where the remains of victims had been discovered years prior and the former Blackwood property. Deputies discovered Ella Richards close to this cave, in a newly constructed hunting house about 3 miles from the main road. She sat in a rocking chair facing the only window in the cabin, alive but confused. A cup with traces of a tea-like liquid that would later be determined to contain multiple plant-based sedatives identical to those listed in Elizabeth Blackwood's notebook was placed on a table next to her. Richards reiterated, "She keeps smiling at me." When he was initially found, she says, "I'm almost ready." As she recovered, Richards gave a startling description of what had happened. In fact, she had been asked to help Thomas Blackwood organize his hotel room's paperwork. He had offered her tea when she had arrived, and she had accepted. She started feeling dizzy and disoriented shortly after. "The last clear memory I have is of Mr. Blackwood standing by the window," said Richard. "He smiled at me. Not a normal smile, but something wrong, something too wide. And then he said, 'Aunt Elizabeth will be so pleased to meet you.'" Everything broke apart after that. Richards remembered being carried into the cabin after being taken in a covered wagon. Although it had only been less than 48 hours, she recalled slipping in and out of consciousness over what she thought were several days. She was attended during her moments of consciousness by a woman she never saw clearly, a figure that stayed in the shadows but moved with an uncanny grace and talked in a gentle, melodious voice. "She told me I was being prepared," said Richards, "that I would help them complete what they had started years ago. She kept saying, 'The work must continue, and the collection must grow.' I didn't understand what she meant. I still don't." Most importantly, Richards said she heard a conversation between the woman and someone who sounded like Thomas Blackwood during one of her more lucid moments. Sheriff Davis immediately telegraphed authorities in Meridian, Mississippi, alerting them of Thomas Blackwood and the potential presence of Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood. They talked about relocating to fresh territory and referenced a place that sounded to Richards like Meridian. It was unclear if this was a reference to Meridian, Mississippi, or any of the other places with that name in the southern states. It was unprecedented that Ella Richards was found alive. She was the first person to survive a kidnapping by the Blackwoods and give a consistent account of what happened. Her kidnapper's quick escape, which was probably brought on by mounting mistrust of Thomas Blackwood's genuine identity and motivations, was credited with her survival. A closer look showed that there was no Thomas Blackwood in Mississippi records that fit the man's description. He had supplied Sheriff Davis with documents that were expertly falsified. His physical attributes, particularly his high cheekbones, thin lips, and extraordinarily bright gray eyes, indicated a closer than a nephew relationship with the Blackwood sisters. The prevailing theory, Sheriff Davis stated in his final account of the event, is that the individual identifying himself as Thomas Blackwood was in fact the son of either Elizabeth or Margaret Blackwood, born prior to their arrival in Crawford County and raised elsewhere until reaching adulthood. His purpose in coming to Van Buren appears to have been twofold: to learn details of the investigation that might help the sisters avoid recapture, and to resume the pattern of abductions they had established years earlier. Public interest in the Blackwood case was rekindled by the Richards incident. Front-page headlines in newspapers that had long since forgotten the story suddenly speculated on the locations of the sisters and the identity of the enigmatic Thomas. Sighting reports flooded in from several states, but none of them were confirmed. The experience had a lasting impact on Ella Richards. Despite being physically unhurt, She suffered from frequent nightmares and grew to dislike tea, which lasted the rest of her life. Within a year of being kidnapped, she moved to her sister's house in Texas and hardly ever talked about her ordeal. Although the cabin where Richards had been detained was examined extensively, not much more evidence was found. The most telling was a tiny set of empty glass jars that were located in a hidden area under the floorboards. These jars were the same ones that had been found in the Blackwoods' long shed years before. The inquiry had once again come to a standstill by the late spring of 1893. No more sightings or events were recorded in Crawford County or the surrounding areas, even after heightened awareness and the dissemination of updated descriptions of the Blackwood sisters and the man known as Thomas. On paper, the case was active, but there were no new developments to investigate. Thus, it entered a new phase of hibernation. Although she kept in touch with law enforcement in Meridian and other towns bearing the same name, Sheriff Davis received no reports of any suspicious activity that matched the Blackwoods' tactics. The story of the sisters who greeted with evil smiles was once again whispered rather than shouted in newspaper headlines as summer gave way to fall in 1893. It was a cautionary tale that was handed from one traveler to another, warning against overly flawless hospitality and fixed smiles. It was unclear what actually happened to Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood. Following the Elilana Richards incident, no verified sightings were ever recorded. The bodies of the sisters could never be positively recognized. It was still unclear where they would end up, Meridian or somewhere else. We do know for sure that at least 21 people vanished in the area of the Blackwood property in Crawford County, Arkansas, between 1871 and 1884. Physical evidence found at the location verified that the sisters' deliberate, planned acts were the cause of these disappearances rather than random occurrences. Perhaps the most unsettling element of the case is still the motivation behind their actions. With its meticulous recording and clinical tone, Elizabeth's notebook implied scientific experimentation rather than traditional criminal intent. An interest beyond murder was demonstrated by the collecting of preserved body parts. According to several criminologists and historians who have researched the case, the sisters were conducting a kind of secret study of human physiology, possibly motivated by respectable medical literature they had come across as children. Others point to specific diary passages that discuss preservation of essence and distillation of vital elements as evidence for more esoteric reasons. According to every analysis, the Blackwood sisters worked with a degree of preparation and accuracy that was out of character for the time period and the environment. Over time, their techniques improved and became harder to spot. Their choice of victims showed that they were aware of which disappearances would garner media attention and which would remain unreported or uninvestigated. One of the first known cases of serial killers working as a team, with distinct responsibilities and a methodical approach to their crimes, is the case of the Blackwood sisters. According to journal evidence, Elizabeth seems to have been the meticulous planner and experimenter, with Margaret serving as her helper and possibly disposing of the remains. Investigators at the time were ill-prepared to properly comprehend the additional dimension that the arrival of a third party, the individual identifying himself as Thomas Blackwood, brought to the case. If, as physical similarity implied, he was the son of one of the sisters, it revealed a generational dimension to their actions that had never been seen in recorded criminal history. I am haunted not by what we know of the Blackwood women, but by what we do not know. Where were they before Crawford County? What shaped them into what they became? And most troubling of all, are they truly gone, or merely continuing their work beyond our reach? Sheriff Davis wrote in his private journal, which was found after his death in 1906. For the rest of Davis's life, the question would stay unresolved. There were no more instances in Crawford County or the neighboring areas that could be directly linked to the Blackwoods. Over time, the case evolved from recent history to local mythology, enhanced in the recounting until it became harder to distinguish reality from fiction. A finding in Meridian, Mississippi, in 1927 then momentarily rekindled interest in the case. When workers demolished an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, they discovered a secret cellar filled with objects that were uncannily similar to those in the Blackwoods' long shed. botanical samples of plants known to be toxic or sedative, glass jars with preserved specimens, and ledgers with dates and mysterious notations. According to records, two sisters called Elizabeth and Margaret Wilson had bought the house in 1894 and used it as a boarding house for almost 3 years before going missing and leaving the building unoccupied. The Blackwoods' general appearance matched the descriptions given by elderly neighbors who recalled the Wilson sisters, but conclusive identification was not feasible due to the considerable amount of time that had passed. Most notably, a number of neighbors remembered a young guy who came to see the sisters sometimes and was known as their nephew. One neighbor said that the young man had a smile that never seemed right, too practiced, like something learned rather than felt. According to the Meridian Revelation, the Blackwoods had moved following the Eleanor R. Richards incident and resumed their activities under false pretenses in a new location. Their shorter stay 3 years, as opposed to 13 inches Crawford County, suggested a more circumspect strategy, possibly traveling more frequently to evade notice. After Meridian, the track became cold once more. If the Blackwoods carried on with their operations in another location, they did so discreetly enough to prevent the formation of any patterns that could be identified and linked to their prior offenses. A journalist called Robert Thornton started investigating what he hoped would be a thorough report on the Blackwood case in 1941. He followed shaky leads and hazy rumors while working in Arkansas, Mississippi, and finally several other southern states. Interviews with dozens of people who reported meeting ladies who fit the Blackwoods' description between 1,893 and 1,920 are documented in Thornton's research notes, which are kept in the archives of the Arkansas Historical Society. Although the majority of these reports lack supporting data, some trends did show up, most notably the frequent reference to ladies who were always smiling, moved in odd synchronization, and showed an interest in human anatomy and therapeutic herbs. Thornton visited a small village in eastern Texas in October 1942 to speak with a woman who said she had been a domestic for 2 elderly sisters in 1915. The woman's description of her employers included a number of features that were typical of the Blackwoods, such as their habit of speaking almost simultaneously and their collecting and preservation of plant specimens. Thornton did not come back from this journey. 2 weeks later, his abandoned car was found close to the Texas-Arkansas line. Neither the woman Thornton had gone to interview nor any evidence of Thornton himself were ever discovered. Officially, his disappearance is still unsolved. For decades following, the incident deterred additional formal investigation into the Blackwood case. Those that were interested in the issue pursued it in private, exchanging information via letters as opposed to open forums. Several documents pertaining to the Blackwood case that had not been included in the official records were found in a concealed compartment in an old filing cabinet by a county clerk in 1968 while the Van Buren courthouse was being renovated. The sealed envelope, which was addressed to future investigators of the Blackwood matter, contained a letter that was allegedly written by Elizabeth Blackwood. Part of the letter, which was written on the 20th of January 1885, 5 days after the sisters broke out of jail, says, "You who seek to understand what we have done have asked the wrong questions. You search for method when you should seek purpose. You catalog actions when you should examine necessity. What appears to you as aberration is, in fact, dedication to work begun long before any living memory. The collection grows, the knowledge expands. The legacy continues through bloodlines you cannot trace, and by methods you cannot fathom. We are not monsters. We are students of the most complex system ever created, the human form in all its variations. We do not expect forgiveness or understanding. We require only the freedom to continue our studies. By the time you read these words, that work will have advanced beyond your capacity to hinder it. We smile because we know what you do not." Although the likelihood of fraud could not be completely ruled out, handwriting analysis verified that the letter was consistent with samples of Elizabeth's writing from her journal. The discovery of the letter led to a temporary resurgence of interest in the case, but no new information surfaced because the most of the direct witnesses were long dead and the physical evidence had been lost or deteriorated. The discovery of Elizabeth's letter in 1954 was the last known link to the Blackwood case, but it wasn't acknowledged as such until years later. In November of that year, Police in a small Louisiana parish looked into the death of an elderly woman who was known to the locals as Miss Margaret. She had spent about 20 years living alone in a secluded cabin, rarely interacting with neighbors, but was well versed in the medicinal uses of local plants. When police searched her home after she died of what appeared to be natural causes, they found a number of notebooks with in-depth notes on the physiological consequences of different plant chemicals. References to trials on subjects who were only identified by numbers and brief physical descriptions were more unsettling. Although no bodies or other tangible evidence were discovered near the cabin, the case was looked into as a possible homicide. The investigation was ultimately closed since no specific crime had been proven and the main suspect had passed away. The importance of the Louisiana discovery was not realized until 1970, when a retired Arkansas State Police investigator looking through cold cases connected Miss Margaret to Margaret Blackwood. However, by that time, the cabin itself had burned down in 1962, thus any other evidence that might have been saved had either been lost or destroyed. The cabin may have been connected to Robert Thornton's disappearance because it was situated about 30 miles from the spot where his car was discovered abandoned in 1942. This is only conjectural, though, as there is no concrete proof that Miss Margaret is related to Margaret Blackwood. It is nevertheless unsettling to consider the Blackwood case's wider ramifications, especially the probability that their operations persisted long into the 20th century and may have involved several generations. It is possible that what started in 1,871 inches a remote valley of Crawford County, Arkansas, continued in different forms and locations for decades, leaving a patchwork of disappearances and incomplete evidence that only the most committed researchers have tried to piece together into a cohesive story. If Elizabeth's letter is to be believed, their work was part of some larger purpose that extended beyond the sisters themselves, passed down through bloodlines you cannot trace. Today, nature has completely reclaimed the location where the Blackwood house once stood. Its historical significance is not marked. Locals, if they are aware of the tale at all, talk about it grudgingly, as if mentioning the sisters who welcomed with wicked smiles would somehow call them to mind. For safety reasons, the caves where the bones were found have been shut, and the precise site has been purposefully hidden from the public. Only written accounts and a few faded photos remain in the historical record after the evidence gathered from the long shed was lost in a courthouse fire in 1931. Elizabeth's journal, which is kept in the Arkansas State Archives with restricted access, and the 1968 letter, which begs more questions than it answers, are the only concrete remnants of the Blackwood case. The Blackwood case is an outlier for those who research the history of criminal behavior. Female serial killers working together with meticulous accuracy and seemingly experimental goals rather than the usual motivations for such crimes. Their capacity to avoid capture and even carry on their operations for decades calls into question how such cases are typically understood. The legacy is more personal to the people of Crawford County and other places where the sisters may have operated, a reminder that evil can have a nice face, that danger can lurk behind a kind smile, and that too much trust can have disastrous results. The most disturbing part of the case, though, is the likelihood that what was found in 1884 was only a small part of a larger operation that went beyond the sisters themselves and was passed down through the generations like a horrible inheritance. As Elizabeth's letter suggests, if this is accurate, descendants of the Blackwoods might still be around, continuing what Elizabeth called their work. They might be anywhere, leading ordinary lives, grinning their flawless smiles, and waiting for chances to carry on the task that their forebears started. The young guy who identified himself as Thomas Blackwood might have had children of his own and schooled them according to family custom. Those kids might have had kids. In locations where disappearances go uninvestigated and outsiders are greeted with smiles that never reach the eyes, perhaps the legacy endures to this day. Sheriff Davis once wrote in his notebook, just before he passed away, "Some nights, when sleep eludes me, I find myself wondering if somewhere, in some quiet place, the Blackwood sisters are still smiling. And I wonder who they're smiling at, in ways that its original residents could not have predicted. the Bitter Valley earned its moniker. Some stories never really finish. They only fade from public view, continuing in shadows, behind closed doors, and behind unflinching grins. This is the reminder that the echoes of what happened there in the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds still reverberate, a dark melody that plays beneath the surface of local history. Residents claim that on some evenings, when the wind blows over the Boston Mountains in the ideal direction, you can hear whispers close to the historic Blackwood estate, quiet voices talking in perfect harmony, planning plans, welcoming unseen visitors, and making preparations. They also say that if you listen carefully enough, you might hear the sound that haunted Eleanor Richards for the rest of her life. The soft rhythm of rocking chairs on a wooden porch, occupied by people whose faces are obscured by shadow, but whose smiles manage to show through the gloom. There is no right conclusion, no ultimate resolve, no moment of justice, and no closure in the tale of the sisters who greeted each other with sly smiles. It merely goes on, evolving but never really coming to an end, transmitted from one generation to the next in a manner similar to the legacy Elizabeth outlined. A lingering shadow over the terrain of American criminal history, a warning story devoid of a lesson, a mystery without an answer. We do know for sure that at least 21 persons vanished after coming into contact with Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood between 1871 and 1884. It has never been established what happened to those individuals after the partial bodies were found in the cave. We don't know what happened to the sisters themselves. It's still unclear what motivations motivated their behavior. All that's left is the caution that their story implies. Avoid those who grin too easily, too often, or too flawlessly. People who live in isolation may extend hospitality too eagerly, so be wary. Keep in mind that every grin has the ability to conceal something more sinister than most people can imagine. That warning continues to be taken seriously in Crawford County, Arkansas. Smiles, especially fixed, unchanging smiles, are observed with subtle skepticism rather than instant trust. Strangers are initially viewed with caution, and offers of help are accompanied by careful investigation. Even when history books fail to remember, the Bitter Valley does. The sisters who greeted them with sly smiles are no longer there, but the shadow they left behind is still there, a cold that lingers long after the story is spoken, a darkness that still affects people who hear it. On your way home tonight, pay close attention. Keep an eye out for odd motions in the darkness. And remember the Blackwood sisters, and take a different route if you come across women whose grins never waver, whose movements mimic one another with unnatural accuracy, and whose hospitality seems too ideal to be real. Because some smiles hide intents too horrible to consider, and some welcomes lead to oblivion rather than protection. They're observing, they're waiting, they're grinning.